in the cotton-rich lowlands of coastal Georgia in 1847, where humidity hung in the air like wet fabric and the smell of swamp mixed with the sweetness of magnolia blossoms to create an atmosphere that visitors described as simultaneously beautiful and suffocating. There stood a plantation that would become known in whispered conversations as a place where the natural order of Southern society had been inverted in ways that threatened the fundamental hierarchies upon which the entire system depended. Merrick Hall occupied 2,800 acres along the Altamaha River, its fields producing cotton of exceptional quality that commanded premium prices in Savannah markets. And its main house exemplified the architectural ambitions of Georgia's planter class, with white columns rising 24 feet to support a second-story gallery that offered views across cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like a white sea during harvest season. The mansion itself had been constructed in 1795 using slave labor that had taken 3 years to complete, with bricks fired in kilns built specifically for the project and cypress timber cut from swamps that bordered the property. The interior featured 14 rooms on the main floors, each appointed with furniture imported from Charleston and New York, with wallpaper ordered from England, and with crystal chandeliers that had crossed the Atlantic in ships' holds packed with cotton bales traveling the opposite direction. The plantation had been in the Merrick family since 1789, built on land acquired after the Revolutionary War, and expanded through strategic purchases and advantageous marriages that had consolidated wealth and political influence through 3 generations. The first Merrick to occupy the property had been Jonathan Merrick, a Revolutionary War captain who had received land grants as compensation for military service, and who had used that initial holding to establish a modest farming operation that his son transformed into a cotton empire during the 1810s when demand for the fiber exploded in response to industrial textile manufacturing in New England and England. By 1847, Silas Merrick was the 4th generation to occupy the main house and managed the 260 enslaved workers who produced the cotton wealth that maintained the family's position among Georgia's elite planter class. A position that included regular attendance at the state capitol in Milledgeville, where Silas served as a state representative, and where he advocated for policies that protected planter interests against any federal interference with slavery or states' rights. What distinguished Silas from his ancestors was not his success in managing the plantation's economic production, which was considerable, but rather his willingness to violate social and moral boundaries that even the brutal institution of slavery nominally recognized as inviolable, transforming his household from a symbol of Southern civilization into something that contradicted every principle that plantation society claimed to uphold regarding family, honor, and the protection of white women's virtue. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Silas Merrick was 43 years old in 1847, a tall man whose body had gone soft from years of comfortable living, with a face that might have been handsome in youth but had coarsened with age and excess into something heavy and brutal despite his expensive clothing and careful grooming. He had married Elizabeth Hartwell in 1825 when he was 21 and she was 18, a strategic alliance between 2 prominent coastal Georgia families that brought both dowry property and useful political connections. Elizabeth had given him 5 children before her death from childbed fever in 1834, following the birth of their youngest daughter, and Silas had never remarried despite considerable social pressure from his mother and sisters, who felt that a man of his status required a wife to manage his household and provide appropriate supervision of his daughters as they approached marriageable age. The truth was that Silas preferred his widower status, which granted him freedoms that would have been more difficult to exercise under the watchful eye of a wife, and he had spent the 13 years since Elizabeth's death indulging appetites that he had previously been forced to conceal or moderate. Marcus Webb had arrived at Merrick Hall in 1843, at age 28, hired as overseer to replace an elderly man who could no longer handle the physical demands of managing field operations across nearly 3,000 acres. Webb was the son of a failed merchant from Alabama, a man who had grown up on the margins of planter society, close enough to understand the lifestyle, but far enough removed to resent those who possessed what he lacked. And he had worked as overseer on several plantations across the Deep South before accepting Silas Merrick's offer of employment. He was physically imposing, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his shirts and hands that could break bone with minimal effort. And he approached his work with a brutality that was extreme, even by the standards of an institution that normalized violence as a management technique. Webb believed that enslaved workers were essentially animals that required constant physical punishment to maintain productivity, and he carried a braided leather whip that he used frequently and enthusiastically, taking visible pleasure in the exercise of absolute power over human beings who had no ability to resist or escape his authority. Silas Merrick appreciated Webb's effectiveness in maintaining discipline and maximizing cotton production. But what truly secured the overseer's position at Merrick Hall was a shared understanding about certain activities that both men enjoyed and that required absolute discretion to avoid social consequences. By 1847, Silas had 3 daughters living at Merrick Hall: Margaret, born in 1828 and now 19 years old; Charlotte, born in 1830 and now 17; and young Catherine, born in 1834, just before her mother's death, and now 13 years old. All 3 girls had been educated by tutors in accomplishments appropriate to their class, learning to read literature in French as well as English, to play piano with technical proficiency, if not particular artistry, to manage household accounts, and to supervise enslaved domestic workers in the complex operations required to maintain a plantation household of Merrick Hall's scale. Margaret was the beauty of the family, tall and graceful, with dark hair and eyes that men described as captivating, and by 1847, she had received 3 formal proposals of marriage from sons of neighboring plantation families, all of which Silas had rejected without consulting his daughter, claiming that none of the suitors could offer economic arrangements that adequately reflected Margaret's value. The truth was that Silas had no intention of allowing any of his daughters to marry and leave Merrick Hall, because during the years since Elizabeth's death, he had gradually transformed his relationship with his daughters from paternal protection into something that violated every principle of natural law and social morality that even the brutal hierarchies of slave society nominally upheld. The transformation had begun gradually in 1840, when Margaret was 12 years old, and Silas had started visiting her bedroom late at night, initially claiming he simply wanted to check on her welfare, but gradually escalating to physical contact that crossed boundaries that should have been an absolute. By 1842, when Margaret was 14, Silas had established a pattern of sustained sexual abuse that he justified to himself through various rationalizations involving his rights as patriarch, his daughter's duty to obey his authority, and his conviction that what happened within his household was no one's business but his own. Charlotte became subject to the same abuse when she turned 14 in 1844, and young Catherine would face the same fate when she reached that age in 1848. The 3 sisters never discussed their father's nocturnal visits with each other, each girl assuming she was alone in experiencing this violation, and too ashamed to reveal what was happening even to siblings who were enduring identical abuse. They had no one to confide in who might intervene. Their grandmother had died in 1842. They had no close female relatives living nearby who might notice their distress, and the enslaved women who managed the household were in no position to challenge the master's behavior, even if they suspected what was occurring. By 1847, Margaret and Charlotte were both pregnant with their father's children, a situation that would normally have caused catastrophic scandal for any planter family, but that Silas believed he could manage through careful manipulation of social narratives and exploitation of his daughter's shame and dependence. But the problem was more complex than simply managing a single source of scandal. Because Silas had decided that the most effective way to ensure Marcus Webb's absolute loyalty and continued silence about anything he might observe at Merrick Hall was to share his daughters with the overseer, creating a bond of mutual complicity that would make Webb's discretion a matter of protecting his own interests rather than simply following his employer's orders. The arrangement began in January 1847 when Silas summoned Marcus Webb to his study and explained with clinical detachment that the overseer would be given access to Margaret and Charlotte on specified nights each week, with the understanding that Webb would treat them exactly as Silas did, and that any resulting pregnancies would be attributed to consensual relationships with young men from neighboring properties who had supposedly been courting the girls secretly. Silas framed this proposition not as a transgression, but rather as a business arrangement that would benefit both men. Webb would gain sexual access to women far above his social station and would receive additional compensation for his participation in maintaining the necessary fictions about the girls' pregnancies, while Silas would secure Webb's permanent loyalty and complicity in activities that required absolute discretion. The overseer accepted without hesitation, understanding that refusing would likely result in his immediate dismissal and that accepting would grant him privileges that no man of his social position could otherwise access. Marcus Webb was given a key to the main house and instructed to use the servants' staircase that provided access to the second floor, where the daughters' bedrooms were located, and he was told that he could visit Margaret on Tuesday and Thursday nights and Charlotte on Monday and Wednesday nights, with Silas himself maintaining access on the remaining nights of each week. This schedule was implemented immediately, and the three sisters found themselves subjected not just to their father's abuse, but now also to systematic rape by their father's overseer, a man whose brutality in managing field slaves extended to his treatment of the planters' daughters, despite the immense social distance that should have protected them from any contact with someone of Webb's status. The arrangement continued throughout 1847 and into 1848, with Margaret giving birth in June 1847 to a daughter who showed unmistakable evidence of mixed parentage, despite both Silas and Margaret claiming that the father was a young planter from a neighboring county who had supposedly courted Margaret County before dying suddenly of fever. The child's appearance suggested African ancestry that could not have come from any white father, revealing that Marcus Webb, rather than Silas, had actually fathered the infant. And this reality created a crisis that threatened to expose not just Silas's abuse of his daughters, but also the violation of racial boundaries that even slave society's moral flexibility couldn't accommodate it. A white planter's daughter bearing a mixed-race child was a transgression that could destroy family standing and potentially lead to criminal prosecution despite the usual protections that wealth and status provided. Silas initially considered killing the infant and claiming it had been stillborn, but Margaret refused to allow her child to be murdered, demonstrating a strength that shocked her father and suggesting that maternal instinct might overcome the fear and shame that had previously made her compliant with his abuse. The plantation's midwife, an enslaved woman named Delia, was ordered to care for the infant and to never reveal its parentage, though everyone at Merrick Hall understood the truth about the child's origins, based simply on observing its physical features. Charlotte gave birth in September 1847 to a son who also showed clear evidence of mixed ancestry, confirming that Webb had fathered this child as well. And Silas found himself managing a situation that was spiraling beyond his control despite his efforts to maintain the fictions that were supposed to protect his family's reputation. Rumors began circulating among neighboring plantations about the Merrick daughters and the suspicious circumstances of their pregnancies, with several families quietly ending social relationships with Silas and declining invitations to Merrick Hall despite not making any explicit accusations that might force Silas to defend his family's honor through the violence that Southern culture prescribed for addressing questions about white women's virtue. In December 1847, something happened that would transform the systematic abuse at Merrick Hall from a hidden family tragedy into violence that left multiple people dead and ultimately destroyed the Merrick family's wealth and status. Catherine Merrick, who had just turned 13 years old, learned that she was next to be subjected to the same abuse that her older sisters had endured, and rather than accepting this fate passively, she attempted to poison both her father and Marcus Webb by adding ground glass to their food during the Christmas dinner that was served to white family and overseer while enslaved workers received their annual holiday rations. The poison was insufficient to kill either man, causing severe gastrointestinal distress but not death, and Silas beat Catherine viciously in response to this murder attempt. breaking 3 of her ribs and causing injuries that left permanent scars. But Catherine's attempted resistance had awakened something in her older sisters, who realized that they outnumbered their abusers and that death might be preferable to continued submission to violations that had already destroyed any possibility of normal lives or respectable marriages. Margaret and Charlotte began planning more seriously, gathering materials for a fire that would burn the main house while Silas and Webb slept. And they conspired with Delia, the midwife, and 2 other enslaved women who had witnessed the abuse, and who agreed to help in exchange for promises of freedom once the immediate threat had been eliminated. The fire was set on January 19, 1848, during the early morning hours when both Silas Merrick and Marcus Webb were sleeping in their respective rooms, and it spread quickly through the main house's wooden structure despite attempts by field slaves to organize a bucket brigade that might have saved the building if they had been motivated to save the lives of the men trapped inside. Silas died from smoke inhalation in his bedroom, never waking from the drugged sleep that Margaret had induced by adding laudanum to his evening whiskey, and Marcus Webb burned to death after waking to find his bedroom door barricaded from the outside and the windows secured with iron bars that the sisters had installed weeks earlier while claiming they were concerned about security. The overseer's screams were heard by multiple witnesses, and several enslaved workers later testified that they had deliberately chosen not to rescue him despite having time to break through the barricade, effectively allowing him to burn as justice for years of brutal treatment that had killed or maimed numerous field workers. The fire destroyed the main house completely, reducing Merrick Hall's architectural centerpiece to charred timbers and smoking rubble that took weeks to cool sufficiently for investigators to retrieve the bodies of Silas Merrick and Marcus Webb. The 3 Merrick daughters escaped the fire with their children and with Delia and the 2 enslaved women who had helped them, and they initially attempted to flee Georgia entirely by traveling to Savannah, where they hoped to board a ship that would take them to northern states where they might start new lives free from the scandal and trauma of what had happened at Merrick Hall. But their escape attempt was betrayed by a white overseer from a neighboring plantation who had been summoned to help investigate the fire and who recognized the daughters attempting to leave Savannah under assumed names. Margaret, Charlotte, and Catherine were arrested and charged with murder, while Delia and the other enslaved women who had participated in setting the fire were summarily executed without trial based on the legal principle that slaves who killed whites could be punished immediately without the procedural protections that the white defendants received. The trial of the Merrick daughters took place in February 1848 and became a sensation throughout coastal Georgia, drawing spectators who wanted to witness the unprecedented spectacle of white women from a prominent family being prosecuted for murdering their own father. The prosecution presented evidence about the fire and the premeditation that had clearly been involved in planning the deaths of Silas Merrick and Marcus Webb, while the defense attempted to introduce testimony about the years of sexual abuse that the daughters had endured and about the mixed-race children whose existence proved that something horrific had been occurring at Merrick Hall. But the judge ruled that testimony about the alleged abuse was inadmissible because it involved accusations against dead men who couldn't defend themselves, and because allowing such testimony would violate social propriety by forcing public discussion of sexual matters that should remain private. Without the ability to present evidence about why they had killed their father and his overseer, the defense had no effective argument beyond appealing to sympathy for young women who had clearly been desperate enough to commit extreme violence. Margaret, Charlotte, and Catherine were convicted of murder on March 3, 1848, and sentenced to death by hanging, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after several prominent Georgia families quietly intervened on their behalf, less from sympathy than from concern that executing the daughters might lead to more public discussion about what had actually been happening at Merrick Hall. The 3 sisters were sent to the Georgia State Penitentiary, where they served sentences under conditions that were brutal, even by 19th century standards. Forced to perform hard labor despite their elite backgrounds, and subjected to violence from guards who resented having to supervise white women from wealthy families. Margaret died in prison in 1851 from fever at age 23. Charlotte died in 1854 from tuberculosis at age 24. and Catherine survived until 1867, when she was released as part of post-Civil War amnesty programs that emptied Southern prisons of inmates whose crimes had been committed during the antebellum period. She lived for another 15 years in Atlanta working as a seamstress, never married, and died in 1882 at age 48 without having reconnected with any surviving family members or reclaimed any portion of the Merrick family wealth that had been dispersed during the war. The two mixed-race children born to Margaret and Charlotte were raised by freed people after emancipation and took the surname Freeman to disassociate themselves from the Merrick family, and their descendants live throughout the American South today, carrying genetic evidence of the transgressive relationship between planters' daughters and white overseer that violated racial boundaries in ways that antebellum society found more disturbing than the incestuous rape that had precipitated the entire tragedy. Merrick Hall was never rebuilt. The property was sold after Silas's death to pay legal expenses associated with the daughter's trial, and the land was eventually subdivided into smaller farms that were worked by freed people during Reconstruction. Local histories of coastal Georgia mention the Merrick family only briefly, noting their prominence during the early 19th century and the fire that destroyed their main house, but generally omitting details about why the fire was set or what happened to the daughters who survived. The story has been largely forgotten by official history, remembered primarily through oral traditions in African American communities whose ancestors witnessed or experienced the brutality that characterized life at Merrick Hall during the 1840s. Modern historians who have studied the case based on trial transcripts and contemporary newspaper accounts remain divided about how to interpret what happened at Merrick Hall. Some see the Merrick daughters as victims who ultimately chose violent resistance as their only available escape from sustained abuse, viewing their actions as justifiable homicide, even if antebellum law couldn't recognize that defense. Others argue that the daughters' decision to involve enslaved women in their plot and their willingness to allow those women to be executed without trial reveals moral corruption that extended beyond their victimization, suggesting that elite white women could be simultaneously victims of patriarchal abuse and perpetrators of racial violence against those with even less power. What is known as this, in 1847, a Georgia plantation owner systematically abused his 3 daughters and shared them with his overseer in an arrangement that violated every stated principle of antebellum Southern society, while revealing the fundamental hypocrisy of a system that claimed to protect white women's virtue while granting white men nearly absolute power over any person living within their household, regardless of biological relationship or moral boundaries. The daughters eventually fought back using the only weapons available to them: fire and deception, and willingness to kill the men who had been raping them for years. But their resistance resulted not in liberation, but in prison sentences that destroyed their lives as thoroughly as the abuse they had endured. The mixed-race children born from Marcus Webb's rapes survived and produced descendants who carry genetic evidence of transgression that antebellum society considered worse than incest, more threatening to social order than the sexual exploitation of daughters by their father. What do you think about the Merrick daughters' decision to kill their abusers? Were they justified in their violence, or did their involvement of enslaved women who were then executed make them complicit in the same system that had victimized them? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in Georgia history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten stories about resistance and survival in the antebellum South, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Remember, the most horrifying aspects of history are often those that official records prefer to bury rather than examine. See you in the next video.